Everything you think you know about classic cinema is about to be burned to the ground in the next 10 minutes. Forget their screen nobility. In real life, these so-called gods were steeped in cynicism, alcohol, and absolute contempt for the very people who put them on a pedestal. We're going to show you 10 monsters who looked at their admirers like dirt beneath expensive shoes and showed no mercy, not even to their own families. Subscribe right now and hit like if you want to know the truth that was hidden from you behind the glitter of the spotlights. And be sure to comment under the video. Do you believe that genius talent gives someone the right to be a scoundrel in real life? Joan Crawford. If you've ever wondered what absolute cynicism looks like when wrapped in sable furs and flawless makeup, look no further than Joan Crawford. This woman elevated falseness to the level of religion, carefully crafting the image of a patron saint of the working class that her fans, humble waitresses and laundresses, swallowed along with their movie tickets. While MGM's official biographers churned out fairy tales about her tireless work ethic, Joan herself, behind closed doors, felt nothing but squeamish pity toward her admirers, mixed with barely concealed disgust. She saw her fans as a faceless biomass whose sole purpose was to keep her alive on Hollywood's Olympus, asking nothing in return except a cold smile aimed at the camera. Her secretaries and assistants later recalled that after public events where she theatrically hugged children and shook hands with laborers, Crawford would rush straight to the bathroom to quite literally scrub the contamination off herself, disinfecting her hands as if she had just returned from a leper colony. She was convinced the world was filth and that she alone was a flawless diamond. This view of people as disposable trash showed itself most vividly in the domestic terror she inflicted at home. Crawford used her adopted children as living props to sustain the image of the perfect mother, but once the cameras stopped flashing, a real hell began. The infamous wire hangers, later immortalized as symbols of her madness, were only the tip of the iceberg. She could fly into a rage because a fan letter in her mail was written in what she deemed an insufficiently reverent tone, and she would vent that fury on the children, forcing them to scrub floors for hours with toothbrushes. To Joan, fans were nothing more than cash cows financing her manic obsession with luxury. She could make a crowd of devoted admirers wait for hours in the pouring rain for her to step out of a limousine, deliberately dragging out the moment just to savor their humiliation, only to glide past them with a stone face, not even granting a nod. In her mind, the love of the public was not a gift, but a mandatory tax the rabble paid for the privilege of breathing the same air as the great Joan. Her arrogance reached such extremes that she saw competition even in her own growing daughter, Christina, doing everything she could to crush her will and erase her personality. The story of how she once held her son's hand over the open flames of a fireplace is not merely a family legend, it is the purest expression of her attitude toward anyone weaker than herself. While fans pinned her portraits above their beds, their idol trampled the most basic norms of humanity, convinced that her star status granted her a free pass for any cruelty. In public, she posed with milkshakes, staging scenes of cozy domestic bliss, but it was a cynical performance for the press, one the children paid for with beatings if they failed to smile wide enough. Toward the end of her life, when alcohol and rage had acconchatedly eroded what little humanity she had left, Crawford carried out her final act of contempt toward those who loved her. She cut her eldest children out of her will entirely, leaving them with nothing, simply to prove that her power did not end with death. She hated us all for believing in her fairy tale, and despised us for funding her deranged existence. Joan Crawford was not just an actress, she was a professional predator who fed on the adoration of the masses while feeling a deep, almost physical revulsion toward them. Every autograph she signed was, in her eyes, a divine mercy bestowed upon worms, and she never missed a chance to remind people of their place in the dirt at her immaculate feet.
The memoir Mommy Dearest tore the gold plating off this idol, revealing to the world a monster who had fed us lies for decades, while her true nature rotted beneath layers of theatrical makeup and bottomless vanity. The true bitch goddess of Hollywood left this world without ever understanding that her greatness was built on the bones of those she so sincerely and passionately despised.
Bing Crosby. If hypocrisy had a physical shape, it would look like Bing Crosby, puffing on a pipe and crooning about family warmth. The whole world knew him as the embodiment of America's kindly dad, the man whose voice soothed an entire post-war generation. But behind that sugar-coated facade hid a cold, calculating manipulator who treated his audience like a herd and his children like laboratory animals. Bing Crosby was a master of distance. He built around himself a vacuum of absolute superiority, a space where compassion and genuine affection simply could not exist. While his fans, ordinary working people, spent their last dollars on his records, Crosby, behind the closed doors of his mansion, perfected methods of psychological and physical terror against his own sons. His view of people as biological waste was exposed most vividly in the memoirs of his son Gary, who lanced the abscess of the perfect Crosby family. It turned out that while Bing sang about loving thy neighbor, he forced his sons, Gary, Lindsay, Dennis, and Philip, to undergo a weekly ritual of control weigh-ins. If a child gained even a single extra pound, this holy father would personally reach for a heavy leather belt studded with metal rivets and methodically beat the boy until bloody welts rose on his skin. He wasn't merely punishing overeating, he was punishing imperfection, punishing the fact that his children were not as flawless a product as he believed himself to be. To Crosby, fans were nothing more than background noise, a faceless mass that allowed him to play golf on the finest courses in the world and live insulated from the rabble. He had an astonishing ability to simulate warmth under the spotlight, but the moment the cameras shut off, he turned into a block of ice. He could ignore crowds of admirers who waited for hours outside a studio, deliberately slipping out through a back entrance or blasting past them with naked disgust etched across his face. For Bing, every autograph was a personal favor granted with visible reluctance. He believed his voice had already given these people more than enough. His cynicism reached its peak in his treatment of his wife, Dixie Lee. When she began drinking herself into oblivion from loneliness and her husband's emotional frost, Bing merely turned away in disgust, using her alcoholism as a justification for even greater cruelty. He took particular pleasure in humiliating his eldest son, Gary, calling him barrel-ass in front of famous friends and adoring fans, mocking his weight and forcing the boy to burn with shame amid roaring laughter. That was his style. Elevating himself by grinding others into the dirt, whether they were his own children or the devoted audiences who believed every lie he sang. Crosby was so convinced of his own impunity that he never even tried to build a relationship with his sons once they grew up. He considered his duty fulfilled. He had fed them and paid for their education, and therefore they were obligated to become his perfect replicas. When his children began to break under the weight of trauma, seeking refuge in bottles and pills, Bing simply declared them worthless and erased them from his life, and later from his will. 2 of his sons eventually took their own lives, unable to survive the shadow of this Christmas monster who destroyed their minds in order to preserve the image of a national hero. Crosby believed to the very end that fans were naive fools who deserved nothing more than the counterfeit image he sold them. He hated us for making him rich because that wealth occasionally forced him to imitate human feelings. The real Bing Crosby was a man without a heart, a sadist in a cashmere sweater who sang of heavenly angels while in his own basement a belt whistled through the air, shattering his children's lives. He left behind hundreds of millions of copies of Silent Night and 4 ruined destinies.
the lives of sons who never managed to reach the man all of America believed was its best friend.
Alec Guinness. If you think Sir Alec Guinness cherished warm memories of his time in Star Wars, you are deeply mistaken. For this refined British actor, the role of Obi-Wan Kenobi was not a triumph, but an indelible mark of disgrace, a stain he loathed until his final breath. Guinness, who had cultivated his snobbery on the stages of Shakespearean theatre and in cerebral dramas, regarded George Lucas's saga as low-grade children's trash, a nonsense for the feeble-minded. But what he despised most was not the script itself. It was you, the fans, who dared to turn this film into a cult. Guinness genuinely believed that fan devotion was not a recognition of talent, but a symptom of mass psychosis and societal decay. Every time an admirer approached him for an autograph, Sir Alec did not see a human being, but a buzzing insect, an irritation intruding on his enjoyment of his own greatness. He loathed the fact that his long, serious career, his Oscar for The Bridge on the River Kwai, and decades of theatrical achievement had been erased by the image of an old man in a hood waving a glowing stick. Guinness's cynicism toward fans reached disturbing extremes. The infamous incident revealing his true nature occurred when a young boy approached him and confessed that he had seen Star Wars more than 100 times. Any other actor might have smiled or thanked the child, but Sir Alec, fixing him with icy contempt, forced the boy to promise that he would never watch the film again for the rest of his life. He reduced the child to tears, convinced he was performing a noble act by saving an undeveloped mind from the garbage he himself had sold on screen for money. Guinness made no secret of the fact that he accepted the role solely for the enormous percentage of the profits, and when that money began flowing in like a river, he despised his fans even more, because it was precisely their bad taste that made him fabulously wealthy. In letters to friends, he referred to the saga's admirers as crude, dim-witted creatures, complaining that he had to breathe the same air as them at public events. He would demonstratively throw away sacks of fan mail without opening a single letter, considering it beneath his dignity to read professions of love from people he did not regard as his equals. To Alec Guinness, you were not an audience, but an irritating byproduct of his financial success. He built a wall of British arrogance so thick that not a single kind word could penetrate it. Guinness despised the very concept of pop culture, believing it murdered true art, and fans were, in his eyes, the chief culprits of that crime. With bitter irony, he remarked that Star Wars was the only thing he would ever be remembered for, and that thought poisoned his old age. At press events, he often behaved as though his mere presence in the room were a tremendous favor, and woe betide the journalist who dared to ask about the Force or the Jedi. The response would be brief, dry, and laced with barely concealed aggression. He hated us all for failing to appreciate his Hamlet the way we embraced his Kenobi, and he carried that personal insult with him for decades. Alec Guinness was Obi-Wan only in your fantasies. In reality, he was a cold aristocrat of the spirit who looked at fans as dirt beneath his expensive shoes, sincerely hoping that one day this space fairy tale would vanish into oblivion along with everyone who loved it. William Shatner. If Alec Guinness despised fans for their bad taste from the lofty perch of British snobbery, William Shatner turned his hatred of his own admirers into a public spectacle, transforming the image of Captain Kirk into a weapon of psychological domination over the very people who gave him worldwide fame. Shatner is a living monument to narcissism, a man who genuinely believes the universe revolves around him, while Trekkies, fans of Star Trek, are nothing more than an intrusive, pitiful and foul-smelling mass of losers, preventing him from savoring his own greatness. His attitude toward fans has always hovered somewhere between poorly concealed irritation and outright aggression. The most infamous moment, now etched into the annals of Hollywood nastiness, came in 1986 on Saturday Night Live, when Shatner, in a comedy sketch, shouted at his fans, "Get a life." Though framed as a joke, everyone in the studio and all of Shatner's colleagues knew there was not a trace of humor in it. It was the raw cry of a man who sincerely viewed his followers as mentally stunted creatures trapped in childhood. To Shatner, fans were never a driving force or a loyal audience. They were merely a source of checks, which he accepted with the air of someone doing the world an enormous favor. At conventions and public appearances, Shatner behaved like an aristocrat forced to descend into a sewer among commoners. While his fellow cast members such as Leonard Nimoy tried to connect with fans and understand the depth of their devotion, William Shatner erected an invisible but impenetrable wall of icy arrogance. He loathed questions about the technical details of the enterprise, despised people in Vulcan costumes, and considered it beneath him to remember the names of those who had supported his career for decades. His narcissism grew so vast that he managed to feud even with his co-stars, who accused him of stealing screen time and of a pathological inability to consider anyone but himself. He treated fans as expendable material. In his book, Get a Life, he attempted to justify himself by examining the phenomenon of fandom, yet between every line seeped the same disgusted bewilderment. How could grown adults waste their time on this space nonsense? He saw fan devotion not as recognition of his acting talent, but as a personal insult. In his own mind, he deserved to be a Shakespearean king, not the guy in a yellow turtleneck trailed by crowds of strange people clutching phasers. Shatner's cynicism was equally evident in how he monetized that contempt. He charged exorbitant sums for autographs and photos, yet often could not even be bothered to meet the eyes of the person who had just handed over a day's wages for 3 seconds beside an idol. His Star Trek colleagues repeatedly noted that Shatner was the only one capable of demonstratively walking off stage if audience questions struck him as too stupid or insufficiently flattering to his ego. He did not simply hate us, he saw us as an obstacle on his path to serious art that to his immense frustration remained forever out of reach. Captain Kirk urged viewers to boldly go where no one had gone before, but in real life, William Shatner wanted more than anything to go somewhere no fan with a script could ever find him. His hatred was not quiet like Garbo's, nor intellectual like Guinness's. It was loud, brazen, and self-assured, the hatred of a man convinced he is a god, and that his flock is nothing more than a collection of misunderstandings unworthy of his even fleeting glance.
John Lennon. If you still believe in the sanctity of John Lennon's image as a selfless apostle of universal love, prepare to watch that myth crumble to dust. Behind the words, "All you need is love," stood a man who felt a deep, almost physical revulsion toward his own audience. Lennon didn't merely grow tired of Beatlemania, he genuinely hated its participants, seeing in the screaming crowds of fans not devoted listeners, but a faceless, hysterical, and dangerous horde stripped of any individuality. While the press manufactured the image of 4 cheerful lads, John simmered inside that cocoon in his own poison, referring to stadium performances as a humiliating spectacle of trained fleas. For him, stepping onto a stage was not an act of creativity, but a nauseating obligation to display himself to a crowd he secretly despised for its narrow-mindedness and its willingness to worship his every gesture. His cynicism reached its purest form when it came to fan devotion. Once, watching from a hotel window as fans, in a frenzy of ecstasy, literally tore apart his brand-new Rolls-Royce, Lennon merely remarked coldly to those around him, "Let them take it. Let them smash whatever they want. They've already paid for all of it. In that single sentence lay the essence of his attitude toward people. You were not kindred spirits, but customers whose money entitled them to a piece of his property, never to his respect or compassion. Lennon saw the Beatles' tours not as a triumphant march of music, but a bloody, filthy spectacle worthy of Fellini's Satyricon, where morality did not exist as a concept, and female fans were merely consumable material for endless hotel room orgies. With chilling calm, he admitted in interviews that the girls who waited for hours outside entrances were nothing more than a backdrop for satisfying lust, and that he never felt even a trace of gratitude toward them. His arrogance sometimes took unsettling forms. He could walk on stage and start shouting insults at the crowd, knowing the deafening shrieks would drown out his words, and he savored this secret humiliation of those who had come to worship him. John saw mass adoration not as recognition of his talent, but as proof of human stupidity. He genuinely could not understand how an ordinary boy from Liverpool could be elevated to godhood, and for that stupidity he punished his fans with icy indifference. Even when he went solo and began preaching peace to the world, his attitude toward ordinary mortals did not change. He continued to live in a golden cage in New York, barricaded behind the walls of the Dakota, emerging to face the public only when he needed to reaffirm his status as a prophet and feed himself another dose of self-admiration. A special place in his hierarchy of contempt was reserved for those who tried to analyze his lyrics or search for deeper meaning in them. Lennon delighted in mocking the intellectual hunger of fans, deliberately writing nonsensical songs like I Am the Walrus, solely so he could later laugh at the idiots who would hunt for hidden messages in that jumble of words. He hated us for turning him into an idol, for robbing him of the chance to be just a man. Yet at the same time, he needed that worship to the point of trembling to sustain his swollen ego. This contradiction made his relationship with fans even more toxic. He despised you for giving him a power he never knew how to wield. For Lennon, love was a beautiful concept for an album that would sell millions, but in reality, he preferred to keep those millions at arm's length, viewing their presence in his life as a systemic flaw. The prophet of peace revealed himself as a cold manipulator who saw his audience merely as a means to personal comfort, and his Imagine was addressed to anyone at all, except the little people who made his name immortal.
Errol Flynn. If you ever believed that the nobility of Errol Flynn's screen heroes had anything to do with his real personality, you were the victim of one of Hollywood's greatest deceptions. In real life, this pirate embodied the lowest vices imaginable. Flynn was not merely a rake or a playboy. He was a calculating, cynical predator who used his thunderous fame as a license to commit virtually any crime, from brutal beatings to rape. While millions of female fans around the world hung his portrait above their beds and dreamed of meeting the perfect knight, Errol himself exploited their adoration with open contempt, using it to lure victims into his traps. To him, fans were not people, but expendable material, disposable tools for satisfying his endless appetites. His private life read like a police blotter. The list of his achievements included savage assaults on women, a pathological addiction to illegal substances, and repeated scandals involving the seduction of minors. The most notorious trial of his career, when he was accused of raping 2 teenage girls aboard his yacht, became the purest expression of his worldview. He genuinely could not understand why society was outraged. After all, in his own mind, he, the great Errol Flynn, had simply taken what rightfully belonged to him as a star. Flynn's cynicism reached such extremes that he openly bragged about his vices even in front of those trying to defend him. He didn't just fail to hide his promiscuity, he turned it into a brand, giving rise to the phrase, "in like Flynn," which became shorthand for a quick and dirty victory on the sexual battlefield. It was said he managed to contract 6 different venereal diseases at once, and this provoked nothing more than a smug grin.
He wore it like a collection of battle scars from a war fought solely for his own pleasure. For Flynn, fan devotion was merely insurance that his next crime would go unpunished because a people's favorite could not possibly be a monster. He despised the very idea of moral responsibility toward the public, believing his only job was to deliver an image on screen, while off-camera he was entitled to any filth he desired. His treatment of women who worshipped him was especially vicious. He could abandon a lover in a foreign country without a penny, or strike her simply because he was in a foul mood after another binge. He saw his admirers as bodies to be used and discarded, and he never concealed his contempt for their naivety or their belief in the myth of the noble outlaw. Errol Flynn was a man who turned his life into a continuous act of self-destruction, dragging everyone around him into the same vortex. His arrogance toward fans revealed itself in his refusal to even pretend respect outside official events. He could openly insult people who approached him for an autograph or cause public scenes, secure in the knowledge that the crowd would still applaud his so-called rebellious spirit. He hated us for turning him into a prisoner of a heroic image, and he took revenge on the world by becoming the exact opposite of that ideal in reality. By the end of his life, when his face had become a ravaged mask carved by alcoholism and excess, Flynn remained in Hollywood's memory not as a great actor, but as a warning, a lesson in what happens when absolute power over the minds of fans falls into the hands of a full-fledged sociopath. He was a pirate not only on screen, but in life as well. He plundered souls, shattered destinies, and sailed off into the sunset, leaving behind only disillusionment and filth, expertly sold as romantic adventure.
Greta Garbo. If there was ever a woman in the history of classic cinema who elevated her hatred of publicity and fans into a refined art form, it was Greta Garbo. Her famous line, "I want to be alone," echoed around the world not as flirtation or romantic melancholy, but as a blunt, unambiguous command to everyone who dared invade her personal space: get lost. Garbo didn't merely dislike her fans, she felt a deep, almost physical revulsion toward them, seeing every admirer as a potential enemy, a thief of her time, and a violator of her peace. While other Golden Age actresses flirted with the crowd, Greta built an impenetrable wall of icy snobbery and enigmatic silence around herself, forcing millions to worship her from afar like a cold, untouchable deity. She turned her reclusiveness into a powerful marketing weapon, fully aware that the more she pushed people away, the more desperately they craved her attention. Yet beneath that calculation lay a genuine desire to have nothing in common with the mere mortals who made her rich and famous. To Garbo, fans were buzzing insects whose noise interfered with her enjoyment of her own melancholy, and she never hesitated to show that contempt whenever she had the chance. Garbo's cynicism revealed itself in her absolute lack of gratitude. She could sit for hours behind the locked shutters of her home, knowing devoted admirers were waiting outside in the rain, and feel not a trace of sympathy. She viewed their devotion not as appreciation of her talent, but as a form of psychological harassment, responding with deliberate, merciless indifference. On film sets, she demanded that black screens be erected so that no crew members or extras could watch her work. She considered it beneath her dignity to be observed by people she did not regard as equals. Her relationship with the public appeared quasi-religious only in the eyes of fans. To her, it was a prolonged game of hide and seek in which she always won, leaving the audience empty-handed. She despised the Hollywood system itself for requiring her to sell herself, and she took revenge on fans by denying them all access to her true self. Garbo could pass by someone who had collected her photographs for decades without so much as a nod, believing even basic politeness to be an unacceptable concession to the crowd.
Her legendary reclusion in New York after leaving cinema concealed an aging woman who saw paparazzi or intrusive fans in every passerby, ready to flee down the street in oversized glasses and a wide-brimmed hat just to avoid meeting the gaze of the rabble. Greta Garbo hated us for turning her into a symbol and stripping her of anonymity, yet she gladly enjoyed every benefit that fame provided, living in comfort and luxury. Her melancholy was a form of elitist egoism. She believed her suffering and her thoughts were so precious that sharing them with fans would be a kind of sacrilege. She was divine as long as she remained a silent image on the screen. In real life, she was sharp, closed off, and often rude, seeing fan adoration solely as a threat to her comfort. She proved to the world that it is possible to be the most desired woman on the planet while openly despising everyone who desires you. Her retreat into the shadows was her final act of arrogance. She left fans alone with their illusions, never granting them even a shred of warmth, because in her frozen world there was room for no one but herself. Greta Garbo entered history as a queen who rejected her subjects not out of nobility but out of disgust, leaving us to worship an empty space she so carefully and successfully guarded from the dirty hands of her admirers.
Marlene Dietrich. If Greta Garbo fled from her fans into the shadows, Marlene Dietrich preferred to stand directly under the spotlights, watching with icy composure as millions worshipped a counterfeit she herself had meticulously constructed. Dietrich was not merely an actress. She was a brilliant engineer of illusion who treated her audience like a crowd at a cheap circus, with irony, condescension, and carefully concealed contempt. In private, she openly admitted that no one had ever seen the real Marlene, and there was no coquettishness in that confession. It was the verdict of a predator who understood the true value of human adoration. To Dietrich, fans were just a mass to be blinded by light and dazzled with rhinestones so they would never notice the emptiness behind her flawless facade. She did not see admirers as kindred spirits, but as victims of competent marketing, and she sincerely despised them for how easily they bought into her screen image of a heavenly creature. While crowds gasped in ecstasy at her appearances, Marlene coolly calculated the precise angle at which the light should strike her cheekbones to conceal signs of age and fatigue. Fan worship, to her, was proof not of human charm, but of technical perfection. Her arrogance took the form of intellectual superiority. She believed herself far smarter than those who paid to watch her films and never bothered to hide her disdain for ordinary mortals. Her attitude toward fans was steeped in irony. With a faint smile, she could recall how her wisdom teeth were removed to hollow her cheeks for the camera, or how her neck skin was pulled tight with special tapes hidden beneath a wig. In telling these stories, she seemed to say, "Look at what fools you were to believe this was natural beauty." To Marlene, public love was nothing more than evidence of human naivety and susceptibility to manipulation. At conventions or public meetings, when she deigned to attend them at all, she behaved like a queen in exile, graciously allowing the rabble to admire her profile. But woe to the fan who tried to approach her with something personal or sincere. They met a wall of polite but lethal coldness. She hated intrusiveness, but even more she hated the fact that her fate depended on the tastes of this faceless crowd. She took revenge on her admirers by offering them the most lifeless, mechanical image possible, one utterly devoid of warmth. In old age, when she locked herself away in her Paris apartment, her cynicism fully crystallized.
She refused to be photographed so fans would not see her frail body, not out of modesty, but from a desire to maintain control over their minds to the very end. She wanted people to suffer from being unable to touch her reality, leaving them only old reels of film as reminders of how skillfully she had manipulated them. To Marlene Dietrich, fans were merely material on which she honed her mastery of light and shadow. She was the blue angel with the instincts of a calculating dictator, fully aware that people love lies more than truth, and she fed them those lies for decades, secretly laughing at everyone who considered her their dream. She left this world without granting it a single honest gesture, convinced that fans were unworthy of knowing the truth about a woman who had spent her entire life seeing them as nothing more than extras in her grand, cold, one-woman spectacle.
Fatty Arbuckle. If you believed Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle was nothing more than a good-natured giant whose pratfalls and absurd chases drew genuine laughter from audiences, then you were witnessing one of the most tragic rifts between a screen persona and a disturbing reality. Arbuckle was the first actor in history to sign a contract worth $1 million a year, and that astronomical sum finally convinced him that he stood above all laws, legal and moral alike. To Fatty, his fans, who saw him as one of their own, were merely a source of an endless river of gold, funding orgies that would have made even a Roman emperor blush. He treated his fame like body armor, convinced it would shield him from any consequences of his excesses and debauchery. In September 1921, that armor shattered in the San Francisco Hotel in San Francisco. What began as a celebration of success turned into a nightmare that exposed the true face of an idol worshipped by millions. The death of young actress Virginia Rappe after a party in Arbuckle's hotel room became the point of no return. Accusations of rape and manslaughter shocked a nation that only days earlier had regarded Fatty as the embodiment of wholesome, family-friendly comedy. Fatty's cynicism towards those who adored him was rooted in his absolute confidence that the crowd will swallow anything. At his private gatherings, he behaved like a tyrant for whom women were nothing more than toys, and fans a distant hum with no right to interfere in his personal life. Although he was ultimately acquitted after 3 sensational trials, with jurors even issuing a written apology, the damage was irreversible. The public he secretly despised for its naivety instantly transformed into a furious judge. People who had laughed at his jokes the day before began smashing movie theaters that screened his films, and this was the cruelest blow of all. Fatty suddenly realized that the fans he had considered his personal property could strip him of everything in a single moment. His view of fans as cash cows turned against him completely. The industry erased his name from credits, and his films were banned from theaters. Beyond the screen, he discovered he was no longer good old Fatty, but a despised outcast whose name had become synonymous with depravity and violence. Arbuckle never forgave his fans for abandoning him in his darkest hour, even though it was his own cynicism and belief in impunity that led him to that hotel room. Until the end of his life, he tried to return to cinema under the pseudonym William Goodrich, only to encounter an icy indifference or open hatred from the very audience he had once dismissed as a herd. His story is a textbook example of how a star who treats admirers like dirt ends up trampled into that same dirt when reality pierces a fabricated image. Fatty Arbuckle died in obscurity, never understanding that public love is not an unconditional right, but a fragile line of credit, one he squandered on excess and cruelty, sincerely believing that little people would never dare to judge a big man. He remains in history not as a genius of silent film, but as a stark lesson in what happens when absolute contempt for those who lifted you onto a pedestal comes full circle, and how swiftly an idol turns to trash when the clown's mask slips,
revealing the face of a monster beneath.
Kirk Douglas. If you believed Kirk Douglas was the last of the Titans, a bastion of courage and honor in a decadent Hollywood, it is time to look at the side of his biography that for decades was concealed beneath the glitter of awards and the machinery of studio publicity. Douglas was not merely an actor. He embodied the image of an unbreakable alpha male whose ego and will recognized no boundaries, either on set or beyond it. While fans admired his Spartacus, Kirk himself earned a reputation behind the scenes as a man for whom power was the highest currency. Yet behind this facade of heroic machismo lurked rumors whispered for decades, forming the darkest stain on his legacy. At the center of these whispers lies the alleged incident involving a young Natalie Wood in the mid-1950s. According to the recollections of her sister, Lana Wood, and the findings of numerous film historians, it was an encounter at the Chateau Marmont with a powerful actor that became a devastating trauma, one that altered Natalie forever. No formal accusations were brought during Douglas's lifetime, but within Hollywood it long existed as an open secret, a story of a young dream of fame colliding with the crushing force of absolute star power. The cynicism of the situation was that Douglas, wielding immense influence, constructed around himself an aura of untouchability. For decades, he played the role of the noble patriarch and philanthropist, while behind the curtain, his name was associated with harsh and at times ruthless treatment of anyone who stood in his way. To Douglas, fan adoration was a tool, ensuring his status as a living god for whom any shadow in the past could be forgiven. His arrogance revealed itself in the way he controlled his own narrative. He was a master manipulator, concealing behind his iron jaw and piercing gaze a complex and occasionally frightening nature. He regarded his audience like a crowd in the Roman Colosseum, satisfied with spectacle and uninterested in the cost at which that triumph was achieved. Kirk Douglas lived a long life and became a legend while still alive, but his story is a reminder of old Hollywood, a world where hierarchy allowed the powerful to remain beyond scrutiny. He was the symbol of an era in which personal magnetism and screen heroism could serve as perfect camouflage for unchecked ambition. Today, revisiting his classic films, it is difficult not to ask where the great actor ended and where the man began, a man whose true nature may have been far darker than his cinematic heroes. Douglas departed this world leaving behind great cinema and equally great secrets, forcing us to reconsider the true price of the Hollywood dream. He despised the very idea that the public might judge him not by his roles, but by his actions, and to the very end he maintained his distance, remaining for millions simply Spartacus, behind whose shield lay the truths that the golden age of cinema preferred not to see.
We're used to looking at the faces of these legends through the soft filters of old film stock, seeing them as demigods descended from Olympus to grant us hope and beauty. But the truth turned out to be far dirtier and more merciless than any Hollywood noir. The 10 stories we've uncovered today are not just scraps of old newspaper gossip. They are a chilling diagnosis of an entire era, one in which absolute fame turned people into monsters, and fan devotion became nothing more than fuel for limitless vanity. Behind the velvet voices, dazzling smiles, and noble gestures lurked tyrants, sadists, and calculating manipulators who despised the very idea of equality with those who bought tickets to their films. They hated us for believing in their perfection, using our love as a shield against justice and as a license for every form of madness, from domestic violence to the betrayal of those closest to them. Hollywood's golden age was built on the bones of shattered lives and on a foundation of total lies, where the image of the kind father or the innocent maiden was sold as a product, while an actor's true nature was safely hidden behind the doors of lavish mansions.
We've seen how easily an idol turns to dust the moment the spotlights go dark and we peer into the shadowy corners of their real biographies. Let these stories serve as a reminder that a screen image is only a mask, and behind that mask there is often an abyss devoid of compassion. They took our love, our money, and our time, repaying us with nothing but icy contempt and the realization that we were merely extras in their grand spectacle of self-worship. But now, with the theater lights off and the masks torn away, it's up to you to decide whether these fallen gods deserve a place in your memory or whether it's time to consign them to the garbage heap of history, where they belong alongside their broken wire hangers and false ideals. Share your thoughts in the comments. Which revelation hit you the hardest? And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to be the first to learn the dirty truths that were hidden from you for decades. Hit like if you believe that no amount of talent ever justifies human rot, and see you in the next episode where we'll continue burning down the false icons of the past.